Hi guys, and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to tell you all about some of my favourite watercolour supplies. So grab a cup of tea, mine's jasmine today, and we'll get straight into it with the paints. I first used watercolour paints as a teenager, and I even illustrated a children's book with this, which is my first set. These are the Winsor & Newton Cotman set, which I keep hold of because I'm too sentimental to get rid of it, even though I don't use it anymore. But honestly, I've always been a very mixed media kind of artist, and I've even been a little bit of watercolours in the past, kind of because of the materials I was using. So I hope this can be useful to you because now I absolutely love them. I've had a mixture of professional and student grade supplies before, but I got bit by the watercolour bug when I purchased this Daniel Smith Watercolours Essentials set. I still have the mixing chart I made when I got it. And it's the first one I ever made. The colour selection and quality of the pigments hooked me, and I still think this is probably the best set to buy if you are looking to start watercolour painting. The split primary palette has every colour you will need without overwhelming you with choice. It's fantastic for colour mixing. I found cheaper supplies frustrating to use and even off-putting, like needing to practically scrape the paint to re-wet it, not mixing cleanly, and having poor chalky pigment loads with lots of filler, and having so many colours in the set it was difficult to get my head around. While you don't need to break the bank to have a good time with painting, I promise that buying a smaller amount of good quality supplies will get you a lot further. I still enjoy using some cheaper supplies, and I might make a video of what I specifically recommend on a budget, but today I'm focusing on what I use at the moment. Honestly, the Daniel Smith paints were a bit of a gateway drug into going full-on pigment nerd, and I got straight into dusting off my Winsor & Newton professional paints, which I was too precious to use much before. Trust me, I have been there with the fear of using your art supplies and messing up. Now I love all sorts of brands, and I'd recommend any professional artist line for quality paints. For me, it depends on where you live as to what is the best bang for your buck. Because I live in the UK, Winsor & Newton tends to be reasonably priced and readily available, but you can also look into art shops' own brand lines such as Jackson's and Ken Bromley. I believe Jackson's paints are Sennelier's older formula, so they're a really good brand. I love exploring new colours and formulas to the point where I've become sort of a paint collector on top of what I actually need for my art. You absolutely do not need this many paints, but I can vouch that most professional quality paints are great, and I'll link to Kano's channel in the description if you're feeling a little lost and overwhelmed as to what all these pigments are and what might be right for you. One of the best things about watercolour paints is that they're rewettable, which brings me on to a good way to try paints before you buy them: dot cards. They really help me not waste time and money and find some gems. I know I loved granulation in paints as well as high chroma bright colours, so I usually start there to find ones I might like. My favourite dot cards have to be Otto's Patreon dot cards, which I can highly recommend. It's great to try out all sorts of brands and pigment variations of colours. I'd find it hard to pick a favourite brand, and it depends on what subject I'm painting, but Winsor & Newton and Daniel Smith tend to be my workhorse paints. And for things like botanicals, Sennelier is excellent. I also love Schminker, Graham, Holbein, Roman Schmal. I also have some Paul Rubens paints. There are lovely handmade paints too. I'll probably make another video about my favourite individual paints, or we'll be here all day. As for palettes, I don't have a go-to single palette, and I tend to squeeze out my tubes onto a porcelain plate. It makes the paint easier to handle than plastic or tin, where it beads up, and you can get an accurate idea of the colours. I mainly use cheap dinner plates and sometimes inexpensive artist's palette with wells. I love bright neon colours, and I quickly grab them all the time. So I created this Paul Rubens Neon Pan palette from the tube set. Unfortunately, I can't use them in finished work as they are fugitive, so they fade depressingly quickly when exposed to light, but I love to use them in my sketchbook and to make prints. I love how much they fluoresce, so it's so fun to use a black light to make your paintings blinding. Now on to the most important part. Just about more important than paint is the paper you use. If there's anywhere to invest, it's probably this. I've been so frustrated in the past with paper warping, balling up and just generally being a menace to work with. So I generally go for 100% cotton paper. Not to say that you can't have paper to practice and mess about with. I actually think it's good to have supplies to help you feel relaxed and carefree. But I tell you, cotton paper makes all the difference. The way the paint behaves is so much easier to work with. I do use cellulose paper though, and it can be pretty decent quality for practice, swatching, or even finished pieces. I think Bockingford is the best, but I also like this Winsor & Newton paper. While it doesn't quite work the same as cotton, I find it's very consistent with the way it absorbs water and the paper texture. I can absolutely recommend the cold press and hot press versions. But my favourite paper I've ever used is this. I don't know what it is. I'm sorry. I'm still on a mission to find out what it is, and I think it could be Winsor & Newton Professional, as that's the only paper I don't really have. Who knows? I'm actually scared to use it. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get more. It's so thick, with a fantastic texture and a dream to work with, and the colours show up nice and brightly even though it's not whitened. I just have no complaints. So this is my favourite paper I can actually identify. It's Saunders Waterford by St Cuthbert's Mill. This is my workhorse paper, and for me in the UK it's cheaper than Archer's. This is my favourite sketchbook, which finally got me to actually keep one, which I thought was nearly impossible as I dropped sketchbooks like stones. The paper is 300 GSM or £140, so it's the exact same paper you get in the blocks and sheets. And I don't like working on paper any lighter because it's a bit of a pain, so I do that in my sketchbook. I love that it lays flat and that I can work on both sides of the paper even if they feel a little different. I just wish it was cheaper, but to get me to actually keep a sketchbook, it's worth it for me. It's genuinely one of my most prized art supplies. My next sketchbook will be one of these, but I got the smoother hot press to try, and I can't wait to try out different mixed media like pencils on it too. I admit I'm also a bit of a paper fiend as well as a paint gremlin, but I do like to try all the different ones out. I love this paper pack from Ken Bromley, as you can try so many different brands and paper textures. Some of my other favourite brands include Archer's, Fabriano, Stonehenge, Winsor & Newton Professional, Bauhong, Paul Rubens, Canson Heritage, and Fluid 100. They're all 100% cotton and acid free, so just look out for that on the packaging and you're good. I love both cold pressed finish, which has a medium texture, and hot press, which is comparatively smooth. It depends on what I'm painting. However, hot press I do sort of prefer in that it's more flexible for different media like drawing, coloured pencil and ink. Moving on, we have brushes. I sort of just have an assortment of random brushes and brands, but my workhorse brushes are from Silver Black Velvet and Rosemary & Co. I do use sable, which is animal hair, so be careful when buying brushes to make sure it's 100% synthetic if you want to avoid this. The Silver Black Velvet are a synthetic and squirrel mix, and they are very soft. I think some people find them harder to use because of this, and I tend to avoid the smaller sizes, but I love the size 8 and 10. They are my most used brushes because of the amount of water they can hold and their ability to hold a point. Rosemary & Co make brushes of all kinds in the UK, and they are my go-to brand most of the time. I have the botanical set, and I find small sable brushes are so important for capturing delicate details on flowers and animal fur. When I want very affordable brushes, I tend to go for Pro Art. Proline Plus is a nice synthetic brush that doesn't break the bank, but is still very good for watercolour and gouache. I like to have a range of brushes, but most of them are pointed round brushes. You can get away with making a whole painting with a good one, as you can get such a range of big to tiny strokes with them. I also like to have a flat brush for when I want a change of brush mark, and rigger brushes for long thin lines. A quill brush is useful for filling in large areas with water and still having a lot of control. Like a pointed round, these can have a nice point and variation too. There are still a few other art supplies I love to use when watercolour painting. Sometimes I also use black and white gouache. I'm sure you've seen artists use white gouache for crisp highlights, but you can also mix your watercolours to make lovely pastel gouache mixes. I like to use black on its own for more graphic work, where I want to achieve a more matte black flat background. I use it with black watercolour and the Paul Rubens neons for a really cool graphic look. In the same vein, I use acrylic ink with watercolour in mixed media pieces. You don't have to water it down for it to flow, and it won't be wet and be disturbed with water on top once dry. Of course you want to have drawings and sketches for your paintings, and I mainly use the Staedtler clutch pencil, which is a thick lead, so you can use it like this or sharpen it to a point depending on your need. It's also quite strong and less liable to snap under pressure. To rub out those lines, a kneaded eraser is great. It leaves a more ghostly line ready to paint over. I also love the Tombow Mono eraser for erasing details. It can get very small and accurate. I usually like to tape around my pieces to get a crisp edge, and who doesn't love a satisfying tape peel? I use painter's tape from Jackson's as well as MT washi tape. Sometimes the washi tape doesn't handle big amounts of water and the paint bleeds under it, so I try to use thick painter's tape for lots of wet on wet work. Test your paper and tape combo before doing your final piece, as you could end up with some tearing. To help tape come off, you can heat it gently with a hairdryer to loosen the adhesive. Speaking of tearing off paper, also test your masking fluid. I like the Pebeo gum a lot, but the blue one stained my paper. I'm using the Winsor & Newton one at the moment, and it's pretty good. And crucially, it does not leave the paper slightly stained blue like in my experience. Sometimes I like to use coloured pencil on top of watercolour for more details. I like polychromos as they're quite hard and can be sharpened to a point, but when I want softer details, luminant pencils are great and buttery. Sometimes I like to have a metallic effect on my work, and there's a few ways of going about this. I sometimes use gold or metal leaf, but it's easier to use mica pigments usually. I like these fine tech Calero ones and the Schminke one. If you leave the water to sink in for a few minutes, you can get a lovely opaque metallic finish, or you can water it down for a sparkly wash. And that's everything. Thank you so much for watching. Please like the video, subscribe and leave a comment telling me your favourite art supplies and if there's any here that you like the look of. Check out the links in the description of most of the supplies I've talked about today. If you use the affiliate links, it really helps support the channel. And with that, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!